All right. So today's topic is a timely topic. It has to do with the solar eclipse, the upcoming solar eclipse, which is on Monday, this coming Monday. For those of you who are not in America, there will be a solar eclipse in the Midwest area. And in some parts of the country, it will actually be a total eclipse, which is fairly rare. And so this will be what will happen on Monday. But we would like to discuss this in terms of what Kabbalah has to say about such a situation. What is the meaning, and what can we learn out from the solar eclipse? So let's start off with a Talmudic discussion of a solar eclipse. This is a Talmudic discussion which takes place in the Masechta, in the tractate called Sukkah. For anyone who's interested, it's on page 21a, Choftes Aleph, in Masechta Sukkah. So the rabbis taught as follows: when there is a solar eclipse, I'm just translating from the Hebrew here, so the Talmud is written in a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. This part of it is written in Hebrew because it is the teaching here is actually a teaching from an earlier teaching which came from Israel rather than Babylon. The Babylonian Talmud was written in Babylon, and that's mostly in Aramaic. But they're quoting a statement here from the rabbis who are from Israel, and therefore the statement is in Hebrew. So I'm translating from the Hebrew now, but there is a lot of Aramaic in the Talmud as well. In any event, this is what it says in the Gemara in the Talmud in Sukkah 29a. The rabbis taught as follows: when there is a solar eclipse, it is a bad sign for those who worship, essentially worship the stars. In other words, for idolaters. It's a bad sign for idolaters. We'll explain what this means shortly. When there is a lunar eclipse, then it's a bad time for those who detest the Israelites. Which is essentially, it's talking in this particular case about the Muslims, in fact. But we'll see shortly. Why? Because generally the Jewish people, Israelites, count by the moon and the sun. And the idolaters count generally by the sun. And the Muslims count by the moon only. So there are some calendars. In fact, the modern calendar that we have today, the Western calendar, is based on solar cycles. It's 365-day year, 365 and a quarter, whatever. And it is based on the solar cycle. So we have 12 months, so 30, 31 days, except 1 month, which has less, as everybody knows. And the lunar month, however, is shorter, so that there's not 365 days in a lunar year, there's 354. And that changes, 354, 355. And it changes according to, in other words, there's about 11 days less in the lunar cycle than there is in the solar cycle. Therefore, every couple of years, another month has to be added in, the month of Adar. So we have 2 Adars, 2 months which are called Adar. There's first Adar and second Adar, Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni. So that month is added in every, it works out on average about every 3 years approximately. It's not exactly, but approximately. So, we are continuing now with the statement in the Talmud. The Talmud continues and says as follows: that if the eclipse occurs in the east, it's not a good thing for those living in the east. If it occurs in the west, it's not a good thing for living those in the west. If it's in the middle of the sky, it is a bad omen for everyone in the world. And we'll talk about what this means shortly. And then it goes on to say various other things, but the Talmud continues after giving various signs of how the moon looks, and sometimes a red moon, or what's called a blood moon, and so on and so forth, and what that means. But the Talmud concludes and says as follows, that for those who essentially cleave to the Holy One, blessed be He, in other words, to God, don't have to worry about that at all. Don't learn from the idolaters who worry about the effect of the planets and the sun and the moon on their spiritual status, on their physical status, and their health, and so on and so forth. Don't worry about all these things. Fear God, not the stars. And that is the conclusion, basically, of the Talmud. Now, there's a very interesting interpretation of this in Kabbalistic and semi-Kabbalistic works. And we will start off explaining the more sort of philosophical approach to what the idea of a solar eclipse is. First of all, the discussion that the sages have is one that deals essentially with what is the meaning of a solar calendar and what is the meaning of a lunar calendar. What do they represent? So, the solar calendar, and we'll come to the diagram, the Sfirot, shortly. A solar calendar represents, let me just get my spotlight here, 1 second. Yeah, here we go, good. So, the solar calendar, according to this, represents the idea of an attempt to find completion and perfection. Why completion and perfection? Because the solar year is a fixed calendar. It's always 365 and a quarter days. It's a little bit off, but 365 and a quarter days. And only occasionally, once in 4 years, you have an extra day, which makes it a leap year, and so on and so forth, in order to adjust for the time. But essentially, the solar calendar, or at least the solar calendar that is used by the Talmud, because again, the Talmud uses both solar and lunar. The solar calendar that was used by the Talmudic sages, that's actually two calendars. One is a general approximation, and one is in a very, very specific, very specific, down to like 4 or 5 decimal places, actually, which is the more accurate and the one that many calculations are based off. In any event, the solar calendar, which is used in general in the world in general today, mostly in the West. It's not used much in the Middle East, but the Western calendar, comprising 365 and a quarter days, is said to represent the longing or the aspiration towards unchanging perfection. Once a thing is perfect, it doesn't change anymore. The problem with it is not that it's wrong to seek perfection, but it generally tends to be something otherworldly. In other words, it's something beyond human experience. In the experience that we live in this world, there is no such thing as perfection. Human beings cannot reach perfection. Only God is perfect. There is no perfection in the human world. And therefore, if we focus on an idealized sort of perfect world, which is represented by the solar cycle, by the solar calendar, it tends to be rather impractical, not impractical in the sense that it doesn't work. It works very well. It works extremely well, in fact, the solar calendar. But it's beyond our experience, and that longing for perfection can never quite be reached in this world. So therefore, it's unrealistic. It's an unrealistic longing. It's an unrealistic longing. It doesn't have a basis in reality. And we see this in many Western modes of doing things. For example, when is it that when does the day change, or when does the day on the calendar change? The day on the calendar changes at midnight. Now, why at midnight? Midnight is a very difficult time to pinpoint precisely. Certainly in earlier times, it's difficult to pinpoint midnight precisely, because from sunset to sunrise would be the area that we would have to divide into two in order to get to midnight. Now, yesterday's time is not going to be exactly tonight's time, right? In other words, sunset yesterday and sunset this evening and sunrise tomorrow morning is going to be slightly different than sunrise and sunset was yesterday. So therefore, most other calendars besides the Western calendar make the change of day. Certainly in the Hebrew calendar, the change of day doesn't happen at midnight, but it happens at sunset, or just a little after sunset when the stars come out, and we can be sure that it's actually night, right? That when the stars come out, that already signifies that it's a new day. So the new day starts at sunset, or when the stars come out, and continues until sunset the next day. That's a much more accurate way of doing things. Is much more practical in the sense that we can see it. Midnight you can't see. Midnight is a theoretical division of the nighttime hours into two. So it's theoretical. And that fits exactly with this idea of the 365 and a quarter day solar calendar, which is a theoretical calendar. It's the theoretical in the sense that it's understood to be a quest for perfection, a quest for constant, unchanging status, which is what the solar calendar represents in terms of Kabbalistic thinking. Whereas the lunar calendar represents the idea of change. But although it represents the idea of change, it also represents the idea of practicality. That's how we live in the world. We live in an imperfect world, and we have to deal with it. We have to deal with where we are. And therefore, things are always subject to change. Human beings are subject to change. There's no question about it that if we don't change, there's only one situation in which we don't change, and that's if we're dead or if we're not born, right? When a person is dead, it's not going to change anymore. That's it. It's done, right? But while we're living in this world, there's constant change. And that is that's regarded as a positive thing, not a negative thing. On the other hand, this idea of constant change, that change is happening all the time, which is what the lunar calendar represents, is something that is very difficult to get a fix on, to get a fixed way of dealing with things, because things are constantly changing. So there's a disadvantage to the lunar calendar over the solar calendar. Where the solar calendar is idealized, the lunar calendar, even though it's practical, it's nevertheless hard to pin it down. It's hard to get things absolutely straight as to because there's constant change. Therefore, in the way the Jewish calendar works anyway, is that you have both. The months are counted by the lunar calendar, but the years are counted by the solar calendar, and one has to make a constant readjustment between the two so that it should be adjusted, and that's why they added another month to make up to the solar year, etc. In the Islamic calendar, they only use a lunar calendar, and that very much fits with the sort of Arabic environment, you could say, the physical environment where most Middle Eastern Islamic countries are, is one that is constantly in a state of flux. For example, if you live in Saudi Arabia or whatever, one of these countries, you'll find, yesterday there was a sand dune, or sand dune outside of your window, and tomorrow it's not going to be there anymore because the wind will have moved it. It's a constantly changing environment. If you listen to Arabic music, you'll hear that it's constantly changing. There's no baseline, there's no underlying theme in the music. It's always constantly changing. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. Life is always in a constant state of change, unless, well, you know, when a person dies, then it's rigor mortis sets in. There's no more change, right? It can't move and it can't change. That's what it is. It's dead. So change has a positive aspect to it as well, but it needs to be brought into focus in terms of the solar year, which is the idea of longing for and attempting to achieve that idea of perfection. Not dealing with the change that is constantly happening in this world, but striving for that sort of perfection, which is represented by the solar year. Okay. Now, in Kabbalah, in Kabbalistic terms, generally the sun and the moon are represented by different clusters of sfirot. In a general sense, in a more general sense, the 6 sfirot of what is called Zer Anpin. I'm assuming that you can see this on the board. The 6 sfirot from Chesed to Yesod, which form the cluster called Zer Anpin, the small countenance. Here in Keter is really divided into 3 Partsufim, 3 aspects. There's 3 aspects to Keter. One of the aspects, the lowest aspect of Keter, I don't have it on this diagram, but the lowest aspect of Keter is called Arich Anpin. Yeah, the long visage. Why the long visage? Because it stretches all the way from here, from Keter, all the way through to encompass all the Sfirot. Therefore, it's called the long visage. The short visage is this here, right? From Chesed to Yesod, or it's called Zer Anpin. That represents the sun. More specifically, the Sfira of Tiferet represents the sun. And that's essentially an unchanging structure. It represents the sun. Malchut represents the moon. As it says about the moon in the Zohar, Leit la, about Malchut rather, Leit la migarma klum. It has now nothing of its own, it has no light of its own. All the light it has is light that is reflected from the sun. The moon has no light of its own. It's not a luminary, even though it was a luminary originally, as we know from Genesis. But it lost its status of luminary and is now only receives light. It's a luminary that reflects light. It doesn't have its own light. So, when it comes to the difference between the sun and the moon, the sun is the source of light for the moon. Now, does that make the moon, by the way, does that make the moon inferior? Well, when the moon is receiving light from the sun, yes, in a sense it is inferior, but the quality of the moon is that it is a receptive. Receptivity is regarded in Kabbalah as, in many ways, the highest of all attributes. And therefore, Keter is revealed, Keter, the highest of the Sfirot, is revealed more than anywhere else. It's revealed in Malchut. Okay, so Malchut represents the moon, and Tiferet represents the sun. Tiferet in a more specific sense, and Zer Anpin, the cluster of 6 Sfirot, in a more general sense. Okay, but let's just take it as Tiferet and Malchut. So Dennis asked, so when someone tells me they don't like change, should I see them as dead? I don't know if you should see them as dead, but that's certainly when someone doesn't want to change, when they're just the way they are, that is in a certain sense, yes, that's kind of a rigor mortis, even though it's not really rigor mortis. Rigor mortis is what happens to a body when it becomes a corpse, right? That stiffness of the body sets in, right? And so that's kind of the way it is. When people don't like change, Yeah, I mean, we're all changing until we die. From the moment we're born until the day that we pass on, we're always changing. And that's, in fact, what the sages say, that this is why this world is such an opportunity. The world that we live in is such a tremendous opportunity, because here you can change everything. Once the soul passes on, and once it goes to the Garden of Eden, hopefully, once it goes into the state of bliss of the Garden of Eden, so then no change is possible. The change over there is only very, very gradual and cannot be, is not controlled by the individual soul. There the change is sort of a universal change, a universal movement upwards into greater purity and greater goodness and greater light, so to speak. But it cannot be controlled by any of the souls. That's controlled by outside circumstances. The only time that we can control our destiny, we can control our growth, we can control our change, is here in this world. And therefore, this world is called a Behilula, a place of a party, right? A place where you have where it's time to celebrate, and it's, this is a place where you dance. It's a place to be alive. To be alive means to change. Okay, so when there is a solar eclipse, what happens? What happens is that Malchut covers up Tiferet completely, right? A total solar eclipse means that the moon covers the sun, right? The moon covers over the sun. Generally, as we know, there's earth there's the earth, and then there's the sun, and the moon is orbiting around the earth, and sometimes the moon will come in between the sun and the earth in such a way that it completely blocks out the light of the sun, and that's called a lunar eclipse. So spiritually, this means that the concept, the idea, the sphira of Malchut is blocking out the sphira of Tiferet. Now, there's two things going on over here. On one hand, as far as we on earth are concerned, we don't see, if you're in the umbra, I think it's called, the dark part of where the moon blocks out the sunlight completely, so it looks completely dark. Looks like nighttime. Where that happens, where that takes place, where Malchut completely covers Tiferet, that means that only the face of the moon, the side of the moon that faces us, is dark. But it means that the other side of the moon, the back of the moon, is completely illuminated by the sun. And that, in a sense, is what you could call yichud, a yichud of Zah and Malchut. Yichud meaning a unification of Zah and Malchut. Now, usually the unification of Zah and Malchut is such that the light of the sun illuminates the moon, and that happens from new moon onwards until a full moon, when the light of the sun now completely illuminates the moon. At the new moon, it's only a sliver, and at full moon, it's the entire moon is lit up. And what happens in an eclipse is that all we see is the dark side of the moon. We only see the dark aspect of the moon. In other words, all the light of the sun is blocked out, and we only see the darkness. But what does that mean? In a certain sense, that means that the moon itself is coming into its own. The moon is, although it's lit up completely from the other side, the side that faces us is as it is in itself, without any light from the sun. It's pure moon, so to speak. Moon not reflecting anything else. It's the way it is. This is called, in Kabbalistic terminology, this is called bitul betachlis, absolute self-nullification. which is the quality of Malchut. The quality of Malchut is self-nullification. Therefore, King David, who represents the Sphira of Malchut, King David, says, Ki ani ani. I'm a poor person, a person who have nothing, poverty-stricken. I have nothing in my, even though he was the king, because he has nothing of his own. He only reflected light from above. But that quality of having nothing of its own is what is revealed when there's a total solar eclipse. It has nothing of its own. We see the nothing of its own aspect of Malchut. That is a sign to us, or a hint to us, that Malchut is in its, so to speak, in its fullness, in the sense that it's showing us the nothing of its own aspect of Malchut, which is the essence of Malchut. Since it has nothing of its own, what then is ever revealed? What's revealed is what is above. The essence is what is revealed when Malchut is completely dark, when it has no light of its own, and that is the moment before renewal. It's the moment before things sort of change and begin to move into positive territory, so to speak, when the light starts to once again shine. But that idea of the moon going dark is a hint towards the future, when Malchut will again become a luminary. As the verse says, Eshet Chayil Ateret Ba'ala. A woman of, literally translated, a woman of valor is the crown of her husband. A woman of valor is the crown of her husband. Meaning to say that Malchut becomes higher than Zeir Anpin. In the future, Malchut will be higher than Tiferet. Why? Because it will return to its original source, to Keter. Keter and Malchut are integrally related. Malchut of the higher world becomes the Keter of the next world, because Malchut has that quality of Keter, meaning it doesn't exude any light of its own. What it exudes is only essence. It exudes the idea of the revelation of the one above, who is not light. In other words, the one above, although we said that before, it was Tiferet, but when Tiferet is darkened out by Malchut, then Malchut only recedes from Keter. Since Keter is beyond the created world, we don't see anything, right? There's no light. So that's the concept of the revelation of Keter in Malchut, is what happens when there's a Likui Hachama, right? When there's a total solar eclipse. So yes, so that's what we're saying, is that perhaps it means that we have the potential to be an open channel to Keter. That's exactly what it means, yes. So just to go back to some of the questions or some of the observations, Terry had said, we all thrive on the familiar, yet we strive for spontaneity because it cannot exist without both. Exactly, right? And therefore we, the fact that certainly in the Jewish calendar we count by both the moon and the sun is exactly a replica of that idea. We strive for spontaneity, but at the same time we thrive on the familiar, right? Very good point. Does this mean that we receive images of what is above us or within us? Yes. That is the thing that we have to focus on the when there is a solar eclipse. And we have potential to be open to the channels of Keter. That is exactly right. And that is what the solar eclipse represents to us. Okay. So, are there any questions? So, if there are no questions, then we can just get, will this bring out dreaming? I don't know that it will, but I'm not sure why you think it would, but As you can see in the background now, I don't know if you can see, but you can't really see. We painted over here behind here. And now all my bookshelves have to be restocked and refilled. All the books are in boxes. It's going to take me a while. Okay, but anyway, in the near future, things will return to normal. All right, folks. It doesn't seem